Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky. Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Where was Sandra? Across the country, parents watched with growing panic as her surveillance video was replayed on the evening news. A young girl in black leggings and a Hello Kitty T-shirt, skipping alone through the mobile home park where she lived. Her bouncing steps carried her quickly across the screen and beyond the camera's view. Just 2 weeks after she celebrated her 8th birthday, Sandra Cantu disappeared. Within days, panic gave way to horror when investigators report that Sandra's neighbor, 28-year-old Melissa Huckaby, had been arrested and charged with the rape and murder of the young girl. Sandra's death at the hands of a trusted adult female sent a powerful message to parents everywhere. The days of warning against stranger danger are long gone, having been replaced by an even darker era where stereotypes no longer exist and families can never be sure who exactly to trust. The book that we're profiling this evening is Searching for Sandra, the story behind the disappearance of Sandra Cantu, with my special guest, journalist and author, Stacy Dittrich. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Stacy Dittrich.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you very much. This is I've been doing this for a little over 3 years now. This is a unique story. Even though we've probably covered everything, this is quite unique, and I think obviously this story was huge in America and worldwide. Almost everybody can relate to this, and you've brought this story home with this fascinating book. So let's start off with just a little bit. I think it's important. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background, because I said journalist and author, but give us a little bit about your background that we will see a little bit later is very important to this story.
Well, actually, Dan, I've been in law enforcement for 21 years. I'm currently a deputy sheriff at the Richland County Sheriff's Office in Mansfield, Ohio. I'm a former detective that specialized in sexual assault crimes. I'm currently on the job. This was a story. Basically, I started writing about 5 years ago, and actually started out in fiction. Because of my background, essentially what had happened is when my agent was shopping, my fiction series around, they were coming back and saying, oh my gosh, she's a police officer, can we get her to do, these specific cases, it would be great to be coming from an aspect of somebody who knows how the investigations work and whatnot, and that's kind of how I ended up down this path. This particular book, the Sandra Cantu case, what had happened is I had wrote another true crime that's actually coming out after this one. It's called Have You Seen Me, and it's a compilation of the nation's most prolific child murders and abductions dating back to the 1800s. It's a compilation of those cases that have really changed our laws and tightened our child abduction laws and whatnot. And, I just have to touch on that because just some crazy stuff that, personally I didn't even know about was, every day you hear about child abductions and people saying, this world is so crazy, it's not like it used to be. Well, there are cases that preceded Lindbergh the Lindbergh baby abduction and murder, which people think, oh, that was the crime of the century. Well, you know, there was actually a case 30 years prior to the Lindbergh baby abduction and murder that just put this nation at a standstill, and even overseas in Europe. It actually involved, you know, the circus promoter P.T. Barnum, and just amazing that, you know, even back then, when it comes to our children, you know, our children are off limits no matter what, and you know, it has been that way since the dawn of time, and it continues to be this way. But that particular book was just this elevation and escalation of all these child abduction and murders that changed laws. Well, essentially, I had included the Sandra Cantu case in that book because it was literally deemed a statistical anomaly by the FBI. They literally could not go back in history and find one case where a female solely, you know, without the aid of a boyfriend or conspiring with her boyfriend or whatever, but a female solely abducted a child, raped her, and brutally murdered her. They had nothing to compare this to. So I included that case in the book, and what had happened is when my agent submitted the Have You Seen Me book, the publisher came back and said, yeah, we'll do that, but we would like her to write an entire book on the Cantu case. At that time, the Cantu case was really gathering steam. It was, you know, it was bouncing off Casey Anthony. It was, you know, constantly in the media. Melissa had been arrested, and people just couldn't figure out. I mean, at that time, you know, I have appeared as a consultant, you know, law enforcement analyst on CNN and Fox News and HLN, and, you know, even myself at the time, along with the other talking heads, were like, there's no way she did this by herself. This was boyfriend motivated. You know, maybe she had a boyfriend that was a sex offender and she's covering for him. You know, we were all making these outlandish excuses when ultimately all of us were wrong.
Now, let's segue back for our audience, because we've revealed a little bit here for those that have not known about the Sandra Cantu. We've got fans everywhere in the world, so there people certainly have been listening, and so they don't really know. So take us back and set the stage and tell us what Tracy, California was like, and we're just talking about 2008. And so we'll just go back to before December 1st, 2008, but tell us, it's a population of about 80,000, according to the records. Tell us, so 60 miles east of, I believe, of San Francisco. Tell us about Tracy, California. What kind of community is it? What's it known for? What's it typically feel like? Set the sort of stage for us for this, please.
Well, I was, you know, I had, I guess, a different picture of Tracy before I got there. You look at a town of 80,000 people, which is pretty significant, you know, of a suburb. It's actually a suburb of Stockton, California, which we've just recently seen in the news. It is the first city in the country to file bankruptcy.
Oh, great.
But Tracy is extremely different than Stockton. You know, I expected a bigger city feel where, in fact, you know, we stayed in San Francisco and drove an hour east into the Central Valley, so it's just, you know, nothing but brown hills and windmills, and then you finally come into, like, civilization again, and here's Tracy, and it really has this small-town feel to it, and I didn't expect that with a city that had a population of that, but it really is a very quiet, small-town feel. They just had a brand-new police chief come in, and I think Chief Beeson was a police chief somewhere in Kansas, and had only been the chief of police in Tracy just a few short months before Sandra Cantu was kidnapped. And, you know, Tracy was a very quiet community. You know, they definitely had their share of crime, but for the most part, nothing significant. And in the months leading up to the disappearance of Sandra Cantu, they took a 1-2-3 punch like no department in the world could ever prepare them for.
Sure. So what happened on December 1st, 2008 to shake up the police just for the beginning of some really very dark days? And tell us about what happened on December 1st, 2008.
The shackled boy?
Yes, the shackled boy case.
Essentially, and we saw that was a high profile, that appeared on the news, but he was kind of scratching their head. And what had happened is a local fitness gym, they're going about their day-to-day operation, and out of the blue, this boy that they thought was like 10 years old comes running in there, completely emaciated, and he's got shackles. He's in his underwear. He's filthy, handcuffs and shackles on him, and he runs into this gym screaming for help. And what had happened ultimately is he was older than that, but due to the emaciation, these people thought this was a little boy. And through Tracy's investigative efforts, they tracked where this boy was being held. I'm sorry, Dan. I'm trying to get my foggy memory back.
Well, basically what
my own book, but believe he was a runaway, but he was picked up by a couple on the highway, and they essentially went back and held him captive and tortured and starved this kid for months. And the Tracy Police Department obviously just couldn't even believe the story. They were like, no, this doesn't happen here. And when they eventually located the home that he had been held in, and the conditions were just utterly rancid, they just had never, up until that point for them, they just had never seen anything like that. It was a really horrific case.
Yeah, it was Michael Luther Schumacher and his wife Kelly Lane Lowe, 13 counts. They starved him, forced him to drink alcohol, do drugs, beat him with belts and baseball bats, and stabbed him and burned him and shackled him to a fireplace for 18 months. Yes. So this is very, very unusual. This is not typical for anywhere. So this is an amazing story. And just when that's just December 2008, and then we have in March, again, something that really close to home as a law enforcement person. Tell us and introduce to Tony Sheneman, too, because he's a very central figure in this as well. He's internal affairs investigation and media relations. So tell us about him, please.
He is, and he is no less than an amazing, amazing person. And, I just want to throw out there that the Tracy Police Department and the San Joaquin District Attorney's Office is really one of the most impeccable law enforcement agencies I have ever come across. I can't speak highly enough. They were so cooperative with me. They are so professional. They are so thorough, and they're extremely good at what they do. And I've obviously dealt with many law enforcement agencies through my career, but I was just very intrigued by them. But Sergeant Sheneman is the public information officer. And, we as cops, we all band together every year and do some fun stuff or whatever. And on this particular day, they did the polar bear, or was it the Special Olympics? Was it the
Special
polar bear
Olympics,
plunge?
and then it was the polar bear after that. Yeah.
Polar bear plunge, and we do that here, which essentially to raise money for charity, you strip down to your swimsuit when it's cold and you go jump in the lake. And he had stated, they had participated in that for years, went back to their hotel room and were cold and tired. And their phone started ringing, and, this was the night of the Oakland police murders, where basically 4 Oakland police officers lost their lives from a rogue shooter, which, at that time, this is, of course, prior to Christopher Dorner, was the largest mass shooting of police officers in California history. And they immediately packed their bags and fled back to Tracy because, a lot of, police officers, in San Francisco Bay Area, Oakland, and whatever, and it's no different here, in the Columbus, Cincinnati area. The cities are expensive. Cities are expensive to live in, and cops, notoriously do not make a lot of money. So police officers tend to go to, outer suburbs, as much as an hour, hour and a half away, to make the lifestyle that they can, keep up with.
Right.
So one of the slain Oakland officers was Sergeant Mark Dunnigan, who happened to be a neighbor of Sergeant Sheneman. And, he was devastated. They had coached soccer together with their kids and whatever. So Sergeant Sheneman was a big part in planning Sergeant Dunnigan's funeral. They had this huge procession from Oakland to Tracy, which, like I said, is about an hour. And the irony of this whole thing is you've got the shackled boy, and on the day of Sergeant Mark Dunnigan's funeral, you've got half the city of Tracy lining the streets to the Tracy Mausoleum for this huge funeral procession of this slain officer. It was literally during the time of Sergeant Dunnigan's funeral is the same day and time that Sandra Cantu was taken.
Now, you say it was around 4 p.m. that afternoon. So while the city is lined up, while this sad chapter in Tracy history is unfolding, and not unfolding, this is a funeral, and the memorial, Sandra Cantu, just a little past 8 years old, is playing with friends in a mobile park. She was an obedient girl, and the rule was not to go outside the mobile park, but she had told her mother, Maria Chavez, that she was going to go to a neighbor's house. There was new girls in the neighborhood and in the new home, and she was going to go over there, but her mother told her, make sure you're back for dinner. So we're talking about 4 p.m. Take it from there. Tell us a little bit about Sandra Cantu. She's living with quite a few family members. Tell us a little bit about Sandra Cantu and her family and what was going on that day.
Well, typically, Sandra lived with her grandparents, her mother, and her brothers and sisters in a trailer park, which literally is a stone's throw from the mausoleum, which is where Sergeant Dunnigan was interred, and ultimately Sandra herself. She could have walked to the front of the trailer park and literally probably watched this procession go down. But on that particular day, Sandra, her grandfather, typically picked her up from school, which wasn't far away. On that day, she came home. She had a snack of macaroni and cheese, which I believe is very significant. And Sandra was known in the park as being a very outgoing, friendly little girl. People would comment that, they'd be out doing yard work, and Sandra would come skipping along and be like, oh, can I help you water your plants or do this? And I hate to say that there was almost a sadness to it, but that was relayed to me from some people, that they felt that, being there were so many family members in the trailer that Sandra just wanted to get out and, talk to people and be social with people. And ultimately, as they're nearing the mausoleum to bury Sergeant Dunnigan, is when the video of Sandra skipping down the street was shot. And that's significant because Sandra's grandfather, they had some issues with vandalism or whatnot. So he had installed surveillance cameras on the front of their trailer. The last thing we see of Sandra is she is literally smiling, and she's skipping down her road right in front of her own home as if she's going home, and then to the right, something distracts her, and she veers off to the right and leaves the frame. And obviously, to the right is Melissa Huckaby's trailer. Melissa Huckaby lived right across the street.
Yeah. Now, tell us about Melissa Huckaby. This is interesting background as well. There's her grandparents. She lives with her grandparents as well.
Right.
Tell us about the religious connection here in the church. Tell us about Melissa Huckaby. She's at that age, at that time, 26, I believe, or 26?
I think she's 28.
Okay.
But yeah, Melissa lived with her grandparents, who her grandfather happened to be a pastor at a Baptist church, which literally sat next door to the trailer park. And Melissa didn't have a job, but frequently went, to the church on Sundays and taught the kids for Sunday school. Her daughter was 5 at the time of the murder, and Melissa had a really, really shaky history up until then. She was, constantly getting fired from jobs. She was having huge relationship problems. Whenever she would tend to date a man, she would ultimately file a civil protection order claiming he was abusing her. She had actually gone into criminal justice and did a ride-along with the Tracy Police Department. So that's pretty ironic, yes. Yeah. She was a suspect in an arson down in Orange County where she has lived. And something really significant to me that the investigating detective, Tim Bauer, said was that Melissa could not and would not be in a 3-party relationship. She would not do it. If she dated a guy and he had a best friend that he hung out with, she would put the kibosh on that. If it didn't go her way, then she would start causing problems and filing restraining orders. And, her ex-husband, with even their own child, Johnny Huckaby, she didn't like the attention given to their own daughter, Madison. And just very strange. Like I said, she accused a police officer of raping her, which turned out to be completely unfounded. Melissa had to be the center of attention in any circumstance that she was in, whether work, whether the trailer park, no matter what, it had to be about Melissa. And, if it wasn't, there were consequences to pay.
Was there any psychiatric evaluation? Was there any terms in a mental facility? Was she ever diagnosed with anything? Was she under any prescription from any amount of time? Tell us about that, if any background was there.
I believe that she, at one point, and this is terrible, the author is going to question the reader. Dan, help me out. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and regularly taking meds. But she had, things where she would cause harm to herself and swallow razor blades and be hospitalized. And, what was really significant is all these, red flags popped up after she graduated high school. And, I talked to her family, and they were very we would have never in a million years thought or saw this coming. And it's like, really? All these, and I actually get into extreme detail in the book on prior circumstances where Melissa has shown, clearly that she's unstable. And her parents, basically, because of her instability, shipped her up to Tracy to live with her grandparents.
Interesting.
So they knew something was wrong with her. They knew, and even to keep her own child with her. I mean, I'm not a grandparent, but I have daughters. And, seriously, if I would ever, God forbid, see one of my children as adults behaving in the manner that she would. I would do whatever I could to get my grandchild, and but their solution to this was to ship Melissa to her grandparents' trailer in Tracy, California.
Okay, let's go back now because there's a little thing missing, all the drama of what happens to Maria Chavez and the family, the grandparents, the brothers and the sisters, and then the entire community, the friends and everyone that they know, and then everyone, the audience, becomes part of the grieving family, we'll say, of sorts. Now, tell us about 4 p.m. She was supposed to be in for dinner, come home for dinner. What happens? She just doesn't come home for dinner, so then what happens? Well, who goes out? What happens exactly? Give us the chronological order of events after 4 p.m. or so.
Okay, well, she leaves, and, she goes out like she did every day. It was, kind of a routine, and she stops down at one trailer. They see her and, just does her little social thing that she does, and people always remembered Sandra fondly because, like I touched on before, she was just a very happy little girl and just wanted to talk to people and interact with people. And at that point, she was supposed to be back for dinner. I believe it was around 6-ish, and she didn't show up. And at that point, I believe it was Sandra's siblings went out looking for her and ultimately did not find her. At that point, Maria Chavez makes the 911 call to the Tracy Police Department that her daughter is missing. Anytime we have missing children, we are extremely diligent in our response time. And first and foremost, and I can't tell you how many times that I've done this, we search the house, literally laundry baskets, cupboards, whatever. And I just want to throw this out there. A good friend of mine and a fellow deputy was working that day, and we got dispatched to a missing child, and it turned out to be his house. Imagine him driving home, he about wrecked. And we were all going through that home with a fine-tooth comb for 20 minutes and couldn't find this little girl. There was a pond nearby. I mean, he is just sobbing, broke down sobbing. And one of the deputies, there's the playroom with all these dolls lying around. And she was just a little bitty thing, I think a year and a half at the time. And finally, one of the deputies walked in the playroom and looked down and was like, oh, my God, for the love of God, she's asleep on the floor. We all thought she was a doll.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's how tricky it can get with the missing children. But ultimately, in Sandra's case, they did what they were supposed to do. They showed up. They checked the trailer. The bad thing is what the detective said to me, and this is true, and people may not like that I say this, but he said you could swing a bat in that trailer park and hit a pedophile or somebody with child pornography. And that kind of amped up the investigation, kind of heightened it specifically because Sandra was not in her home, not at any of the friends that she had been in, had never not shown up before. It was completely out of character. So basically, at the time, the first responders, the uniformed patrolmen, are searching this trailer park. They're talking to Sandra's mom and whatnot. And, what I write in the book with Sergeant Tony Sheneman, the PIO, that has helped organize Sergeant Dunnigan's funeral, was that he was exhausted, from the Shackled Boy case to the funeral that same day. Literally just came home and just peeled his clothes off and fell in bed. And it was just a matter of hours that his phone rang, and it was one of the officers that said, I think we got a problem here. And he said, you just lay there and you're exhausted and you think, this just can't happen like this, 3 times in a row. And he got out of bed and went to the scene and realized, my God, this is bad. This is really bad. And it was just that constant chain of events that this department and this community had gone through so back to back that everybody was just, totally on heightened alert.
Now, we talk about, you talk extensively in the book that normally within 12 hours the cases are usually resolved one way or another. And luckily and fortunately, a lot of these kids are found within that 12 hours. But consequently, or as a result, after 12 hours, the police are not looking at this very optimistically. Now, you say the search was extensive, and you touched on the sex offenders that were, again, police said there's a bunch of them in this trailer park alone here. So tell us how extensive this this search was. You talk about you went through all the sex offenders, then you went down the possible pathways, the school pathways. Give us how extensive this search really was.
Well, like I said, this community was amazing. I'm not going to lie and say I don't know that would happen here. It was like instantaneous that the word got out. There was a huge mix-up of an email or a fax sent to local media. Apparently the police department had an old fax number, so the media didn't get it right away. But essentially word of mouth spread through Tracy, and you had volunteers coming out by the hundreds. And essentially what happens in a missing kid case is, like I said, you will initially do a full, thorough search of the home, and you will, that's your ground zero, and you take it from there. Any friends or anybody, sex offenders, if I'm an officer and there's a sex offender 3 doors down from a missing child, I'm going to call their probation officer, because probation officers don't need search warrants. They can search the house. I'm going to say, give me permission. That's all there is to it. But most sex offenders, if they literally aren't wrong, they're like, come on in. I didn't do anything. They're scared. They're like, come on in, search my house. I didn't do anything. And then, of course, you've got so many irrigation ponds and canals and things around that particular area, which is always a huge concern for law enforcement. And, Melissa was not even a thought in those first 3 days. They were searching. There was at one point, I believe, one of the volunteers found a small T-shirt in the landfill, and they really started to focus in on the landfill. But you know what? Ultimately, Melissa, wanting to be the center of attention that she is, she, jumped herself right in there as usual and drew attention to herself. So, but it was just unbelievable. They had search and rescues from other counties and national search and rescues, and everybody was basically searching for Sandra, that whole city. One way or another took an active part in looking for this little girl.
Mm-hmm. Now, on April 6th, this Jose Luis Franco discovered a suitcase in one of the ponds that you were just speaking about, and it contained a suitcase, and that he was working at a dairy farm. So tell us what they discover. On
April 6th, basically, and I have pictures of this farm in the book, but, I personally, went out there and stood at the bank where her remains were found. It is so incredibly secluded. It's very peaceful, and obviously since that happened, just this eeriness, standing out there. It's about 1.5 miles from the trailer park, and you've got these irrigation ponds that have, manure and methane and whatnot. So the dive teams could not search these irrigation ponds, for totally put risk to the officers, the divers. But essentially, he was driving, he would check the ponds and do his daily duties, and he happened to see something in the middle of one particular irrigation pond. He had been watching the news. Obviously, he had been, like I said, the whole community, the whole nation was aware of what was going on. He was concerned for his children. He actually said he would not allow his children to play in the front yard ever since Sandra Cantu disappeared. And he was able to pull the suitcase to the bank. It was a large, one of those larger suitcases, and it had, cords wrapped around it. And when he pulled it up, he was able to determine that, oh my God, his first thought was, oh God, I hope this little girl isn't in the suitcase. He immediately called authorities who went out there, and I'll tell you, it was a long time. And again, just to reiterate how wonderful the Tracy Police Department is, everybody wanted to, open the suitcase, but, they did their due diligence and they took their time, and that's what you're supposed to do. They processed that entire scene before that suitcase was even removed from the bank. And ultimately, and tragically, the suitcase was transported to the San Joaquin County Coroner's Office. And that is where it was opened, and that's where it was determined that it held the remains of Sandra Cantu.
Now, they were doing other things like looking at, like you say, they had video surveillance just because of the grandfather had hooked up a video camera. After they have the body, they do the autopsy. Give us the chain of events that lead to Melissa's, the discovery that Melissa will be a suspect in this. How do they make that connection from this evidence? Tell us how the police proceed from here.
Well, like I said, Melissa pretty much inserted herself in the investigation. There was actually a memorial service with hundreds upon hundreds of people to the entrance of the trailer park, and this was before Sandra's body was found. There were FBI agents and cops all over just observing the crowd, and there was literally no wind that day. And Melissa, lo and behold, finds a note just lying on the ground that said, Cantu in suitcase at the Shetty and Whitehall Road. Well, she runs up to an FBI agent, absolutely hysterical. Oh, my God, oh, my God, oh, my God, look what I found. And obviously that was odd. Somebody just dropped this, between two trailers. They wouldn't put it on a car or whatnot. So that piqued their interest a little bit. They went back and interviewed her, and ultimately Melissa had actually reported her suitcase stolen. She had said that she had this huge Eddie Bauer suitcase in front of her house, and it was stolen. And a reporter from the Tracy Press found out that she had reported this and called her, and Melissa's like, oh, yeah, that was my suitcase. It was stolen. Well, little did she know, up until this point, Melissa had already been, Tracy Police and FBI had already wired Melissa's phone calls and were monitoring her phone calls. Also because she had swallowed razor blades and gone to the hospital. They also realized that in January, 3 months before Sandra Cantu went missing, a little girl had been drugged in that trailer park, and she had been with Melissa Huckaby. And ultimately, for whatever reason, the investigators were looking at the mother, that the kid accidentally got into the mother's medication or whatnot. They called Children's Services. Melissa was never even questioned, even though kids said, Melissa took me through McDonald's and got me a water, and the water tasted funny.
Yeah.
And that little girl had the same drugs in her system that Sandra Cantu had. Flash forward to the beginning of March, 3 weeks before Sandra Cantu was abducted and murdered. Melissa had a boyfriend by the name of Daniel Plowman who ultimately broke up with her. She had asked him to meet her so they could discuss the nature of their relationship. The following morning, Daniel was found in his car in a parking lot and arrested for DUI. He was found to have these same drugs that the little girl in January had, the benzodiazepines, that he had in his system and Sandra Cantu had in his system. Not remember anything. He remembered Melissa giving him something to drink. So, they start to pull all this together. And ultimately a search on Melissa's computer after she was arrested, this was so premeditated. She had looked up waterways and ponds in San Joaquin County. She had researched the sex offenders in San Joaquin County. She had actually pulled up a CNN article of a father, and I believe it was in Israel, that murdered his child, put her in a suitcase, and dumped her in a pond. This was all on Melissa's computer. She was clearly planning, looking for an alibi. I believe that the girl in January was a test case to see how the drugs would affect her.
Right.
When she drugged her soon-to-be ex-boyfriend, Daniel Plowman, at the beginning of March, that was her way of getting it on record that he had those drugs in his system. I believe that Melissa was trying to set up Daniel Plowman for Sandra's murder to get back at him because he broke up with her. And on top of all this, she hated Sandra. She hated her. Sandra represented everything that her daughter wasn't. Sandra was a beautiful little girl. She had nice clothes. She'd come over to play with Melissa's daughter, Madison, and say, oh, look at my nice new shirt. Madison was very introverted, was not a cute little girl. I hate to say that. And Melissa hated her. She really hated her. And that is just my opinion, that she had planned all this from January. She wanted to get rid of Sandra and blame Daniel in the process. And she figured it was a double bonus, get rid of both of them, because they both wronged her in some way. That's what I believe.
Now, I'm listening to your theory, and you're giving credible evidence, especially with what you've outlined in the book and what did you just mention. What I wanted to ask was, do you believe that was why she committed these sex offenses against Sandra, to sort of lead police away from, again, like you say, the FBI has no record of someone abducting, sexually assaulting, and then murdering a child, and it's quite heinous what the sexual assault with a rolling pin on this young girl. Do you think that would account for these sex offenses, or did the police find any evidence with the computer checks that she had any predilection for being a sex offender herself?
Now, there is a disagreement between the district attorney and the lead investigator on this. The district attorney believes that Melissa had a proclivity towards little girls. I agree with the investigating detective. Absolutely not. This was merely a ploy to make it look like it was a man, and I believe ultimately to direct it all back to Daniel Plowman. One of the things that Melissa said, because like I said, she had taken criminal justice classes, and it was just so off the wall. She admitted to murdering Sandra, but she said, standing in court in front of Sandra's mother, said, I never sexually assaulted her, and told the detective when they were interviewing her, she goes, yes, I accidentally killed her, but I never raped her, touched her. That's gross. Like, Melissa knows that child rapists are the lowest of society, so she didn't want to be thought of as dirty as a child rapist, but she's okay to admit that she, quote, accidentally murdered Sandra. And by accidentally, meaning Sandra's in a suitcase laying there unconscious. Melissa goes because she crawled in there. Melissa was claiming that Sandra came over, crawled in the suitcase to scare her. Melissa didn't know she was in there, drove to the church, brought the suitcase in, and saw Sandra there suffocated. And Melissa gets so upset, she drinks this concoction that she's given 2 other people of the benzodiazepine with water and spit, and it somehow lands in Sandra's mouth. Mm-hmm, I mean, it is so ridiculous. Yeah. One of the things that I picked up on is that Melissa's grandmother found a rag in the laundry room the night Sandra went missing, and it appeared to be vomit with, like, macaroni noodles. And I thought that was very interesting because Sandra had eaten macaroni and cheese for her after-school snack. And to this day, the lead detective and the DA, they don't know exactly what transpired or how Melissa got Sandra to the church or whatever, but I honestly think that Melissa probably had this rag soaked with these drugs and put it over Sandra's face and to where she vomited on the rag before putting her in the suitcase and transporting her to the church. But, you know, she also Sandra had a noose around her neck. She was sexually assaulted. You know, it was so brutal. It was so brutal. And this woman, she wouldn't take responsibility for it. She actually stated that she had contemplated putting the suitcase with Sandra's body in front of Sandra's trailer where her mother could find it.
Oh, jeez. What did the church have to do with this? What was her idea there, or what was actually what was the church connection?
Melissa could be alone. She knew nobody was at the church. She had the keys. People saw her across the street go in, and apparently didn't think much of it. But, you know, it was quiet. She knew she wouldn't be disturbed. She cut the strings off the blinds inside the church, used those to tie up the suitcase. Of course, the rolling pin in the church she used to sexually assault Sandra. You know, she had a noose tied around her neck that came from the church. There was quite a bit of evidence in the church. This is where it transpired. And generally, I think she took her there because she could be alone.
There was no indication that she was using a church to throw some kind of satanic element to it at all?
No.
Again, we're talking about a kind of deluded person, right, who
well,
thinks
she
kind
is
of clever.
deluded, obviously. But, no, she went to the church because, first of all, she had the keys. She knew nobody was supposed to be there or going to be there. And whatever it is that she had to do, she could do it and not be disturbed, and, you know, no one would see her doing it, you know, giving Sandra, you know, the benzodiazepines that she had in her system and doing the sexual assault. And then, you know, she actually pulled her pants back up, which was very significant. Genuinely, when you get into these violent child murder rapists, they don't bother to do that. And Melissa dressed her back up. So that was pretty significant in terms of, her thought process. She knew exactly what she was doing. And, even she goes out and dumps the suitcase, and a couple that live down the road happen to be driving by, and they don't typically see cars out there, so the gentleman stopped and, said, "Are you okay, or what are you doing out here?" And, she was just as friendly as ever. She noticed a Marine sticker in the back of this guy's car and says, "Oh, are you in the Marines? My brother's a Marine." And just, she just dumped the body of an 8-year-old into a sewage pond, and that was her mentality, but she's not very smart, obviously, and, so this was a very, very strong witness. Ultimately, Melissa had no other option but to take a plea deal of life in prison, or, there's just no way around it.
Was the interview with the lady's name, Wadsworth, the reporter, was that useful at all? Because she had, again, you say like she inserted herself into the investigation, but the person from the Tracy Press, I guess, I can't remember the newspaper, sorry, but that Wadsworth woman, was that interview useful for police at all, or for prosecution? No,
and that's kind of an interesting story, because I figured it was. Dr. Phil, through all my research, Dr. Phil, Geraldo, they had all had her on, like this reporter that broke open the Melissa Huckaby case. And I had actually interviewed her before the lead investigator. And, she was claiming she tracked down Melissa. Melissa admitted that was her suitcase, and that she was in the hospital for swallowing razor blades and whatnot. And that's what led police to Melissa Huckaby, was her article that Melissa had told her all this, that came out in the newspaper the next day. And what was really interesting to me is when I interviewed the lead detective, he was pretty negative about all that, which I thought was awesome. I'm like, say it like it is, but he said, this reporter actually went and said she did this and this, but by that time, we had already had Melissa on a wire. So her conversation that she wrote about in this article was nothing but a hill of beans to us. So there was some conflict going on there that, behind closed doors, that people weren't necessarily aware of. I wasn't aware of it, which kind of was a wow moment for me, doing the research in the book.
Mm-hmm. What I found very, very interesting, too, is, again, I always like the personal aspect of people including themselves in the story. And, of course, you were a character in this book as well, and a very strong character. And you talk about when you heard about the murder, and you were talking about when you were asked your expert opinion by TV and radio in radio and TV interviews, you were off, and as like everyone else, you were pretty convinced it was a male offender. Tell us a little quip that you have in your book about your daughter, and your daughter kind of arguing with you, and it being ironic again.
It was, because we had, between Casey Anthony and this case, we were all on the networks, giving our expert quote opinions, and we were like, well, Sandra was seen. Male was seen kissing Sandra at the pool the summer before, and they really need to look at him. And we're going out there and what we're supposed to do. And the day Sandra's body was found, and obviously my daughters know, they watch me when I do commentating and stuff, and I was kind of in shock, standing in my living room like, oh, my God, I can't believe this, I wish it would have been a better outcome, and this is upsetting. They found this poor little girl, and they had initial reports that a white pickup truck with 2 males were seen leaving the scene. And I was like, oh, my God, I hope they catch this monster or whatever. And my daughter was 13 at the time, and she goes, you know how teenagers are with their attitudes. She's like, how do you know it's a he? And I was like, well, what do you mean, how do I know? Of course it's a he. She goes, well, you don't know that. And I'm like, of course it's a he. What woman would do something this sick? She goes, well, I think it could be a woman. I just think you don't know what you're talking about. You know, real smart alecky like kids do. And, boy, she didn't let me live that down, you know. She still brings it up. But I'm like, you know what, good for you, because I told her, I said, you know what, we should have been thinking like you do. You know, I said, in law enforcement, we are so trained from point A to B to C to this to this to this, and this is what we got to look for and blah, 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 that our minds aren't completely open, and I'm the first to admit that, and that's why this book was so important. You know, the FBI, the law enforcement, everybody in San Joaquin was shocked because this does not fit the quote-unquote profile. You know, this is not how you're supposed to commit a crime. It was almost like being angry at Melissa. You shouldn't have done this because we weren't prepared for this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and law enforcement couldn't have possibly, what they realized is that you couldn't have possibly profiled her from other offenders' behavior because she's unique in that respect.
Exactly. So and, you know, our training, we're constantly being trained, and when we're trained, this burns into our brain for 10, 20, 25 years, and we're unfortunately almost like robots in that regard. And I sincerely hope that this book, not only to parents, you know, to say, hey, you know that creepy PTA mom that you think's creepy? Yeah, don't let your kid go down there and make cupcakes. Let's use a little common sense, because the days of the stranger dangers are over. But in terms of law enforcement, I hope that this book also opens their eyes, that we need to be trained differently, that we need to not focus on one particular race or profile, and we need to learn to open our eyes. I know that that's happened in San Joaquin after this unfortunate case. I just hope that it picks up, you know, nationwide and worldwide.
Yeah, and I think, too, that you know, we have a sort of an idea of how serial killers are, and I know this has been an education for me. And every week I talk to somebody else and I get a more of an understanding. I had Catherine Ramslin on last week, and she says, you know, there's no real profile. You know, these people are very, very different. So to say this is typical and this is how you identify, it might look good on TV, fiction, but in reality, you might not want to jump to conclusions. That's all.
And really, that's a very, very telling statement, because, you know, most parents have this image embedded in their brain of this nerdy-looking guy with his shirt buttoned up to the collar with Coke bottle glasses standing on the street corner holding a puppy. You know, that's the guy to be scared of because he's going to snatch your kid. Well, guess what? You know, that's not it. You've got family members. You know, obviously in my job, you see everything. Family members, cousins, you know, neighbors. It's just, look, we got to use common sense nowadays. You know, so many people are medicated. We've got a huge mental health issue. And it's just, you know, as parents, like I said, Melissa was like that, and I say this in the book, like that obnoxious neighbor that when you see her coming, you don't answer the door and you hope she doesn't see you, that knows everybody's business. She's a little on the weird side. But, you know, as a parent, if you know, have a male or female or that principal that you think's a little weird and he calls you and said, your kid missed the bus, I'll bring her home. Yeah, no. I'm like, my kids think I am like the most strictest, crazy parent in the world. But you know what? You just have to be really diligent nowadays, and nobody's safe. You have to say that to yourself.
So you're saying there's no real way of safeguarding yourself, too, because we don't want to make it sound like this kid was just left running wild. But at the same time, when people move to suburbs, we'll say whether it's a trailer park, and we have some preconceived idea what trailer parks all are, but there's quite a bit of difference wherever you are and in terms of affluence. But the thing is, in a suburb, we might have the same idea. I mean, less so than years ago where people kind of hung around with each other in the neighborhood. We've gone past that. But again, I know what you're trying to warn against, but what exactly could people do? Again, you've just kind of scared the audience a little bit. But what, as a law enforcement professional?
I hope to. But look at Elizabeth Smart. I mean, there is a prime example of, okay, and I don't mean to scare people, but her parents didn't do anything wrong. Ultimately, this guy crawled in her window and took her. Same with Polly Klaas. Mm-hmm. I try very hard not to, and in the case of Polly Klaas and Elizabeth Smart, there was pretty much nothing, that could have prevented that. Sandra's case was a little different. I don't know how much, help me out, Dan, how do I say this nice? Supervision. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is, when my daughter was 8, she was not allowed to run around the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. That just wasn't allowed, specifically without me checking on her. And, like I said, you can't live your life in a shoebox. You can't be scared every day. All I'm saying is human beings were given this amazing emotion or whatever it is called instinct. And as a parent, if something does not feel right to you as a parent, don't be embarrassed. Don't worry about hurting somebody's feelings. Trust your instincts. That's the bottom line. I see people, oh, gosh, I just didn't feel right about that, but I don't want to seem rude. Hey, guess what? Your child has one life, and if your instincts or your gut is telling you something's wrong or something's not right, hey, feel free to go ahead and follow that because, 9 times out of 10, you're probably right. And that's basically all I'm saying. I'm not saying, my God, lock your kid in his room 24/7, don't ever let him out. But just, as a parent, if something doesn't seem right to you or somebody seems a little off to you or you've got red flags popping up in your head, don't dismiss it. Don't dismiss it and say, oh, I'm just being paranoid. We live in a small town. Nobody does anything around here. Don't dismiss it.
Yeah.
And that's basically the thing.
What I found, and again, it's easy to blame after the fact, and I don't know the family situation, and I'm sure they were obviously loving people, but she's 8 years old, and I know that when I was young, my mother was overprotective, but still protective, but overprotective. And my own daughter was, again, maybe you could call it sheltered, but 8 years old is awfully young to be. If it was your cousins, your sister, a family, and you knew that they were down the street, but new friends in the neighborhood and people in a trailer park, and then she's only 8 years old, I think that's probably not wise.
Well, what's so funny about that is I look back at my childhood, and my brother, I have an older brother, and during the summer we left in the morning and literally did not come back until dark. Mm-hmm. No cell phones. Our parents never checked on us, and I actually make fun of my parents. I'm like, really? We could have been kidnapped. You guys are horrible parents. We ran the neighborhood. I mean, it was crazy. And, there's just no way. I mean, my oldest daughter is 17. She has her driver's license, and she is literally allowed to drive into town and back. She's not allowed, when I got my driver's license, I was driving to Cleveland and Columbus, like, within a week. And with her, it's like, no, you're driving 5 miles to school and back. That's it. It's just, and my youngest is 10. Like I said, they think we're the worst parents in the world, but we're just doing what we do. My husband's been a police officer for 23 years. I've been doing it for 21 years. And, things are different, and, I don't know what to say. But, like I said, basically it boils down to, as a parent, don't fall into the pressure of society and say, I don't want to feel rude. I don't want to come off as being paranoid. But if this person bothers me and they just give me that weird feeling, you know what? Again, that's your child. Always fall on the air of safety. Don't, if you offend somebody, guess what? So what? So what? It's your child. Somebody messes with my kid, I'm coming out with fangs and claws. And I'm sorry if somebody's offended like that. Luckily, I have not come into that situation. But, it kills me that people, they get this mentality, specifically in small towns, where they're, in my job, the home invasions and the robberies or whatever, and their doors are unlocked. And, one of the things I say to them is, why are your doors unlocked? Well, we've never had any trouble around here. I've left my doors unlocked for 25 years. Well, that's just dumb. And, when I go pick up my kids from school, I see these little itty-bitty kids, like 5 years old, walking home. The street they're walking on is completely empty. And, it's me being me. But I look and I'm thinking, oh, my God, why are they, no, if somebody ran and snatched that little boy, no one would see anything. And those are the towns that it happens in. It's not the big cities. When you see significant child abductions, you'll see a lot of them are these smaller towns where the police department is not necessarily educated or, not necessarily staffed where they should be, where these pedophiles and child molesters are able to blend in and plan and watch and whatever and go unnoticed. Those are the places that tends to take place in, and that is what I really want to, drive home to people. Don't get complacent and think you live in a bubble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the old adage about small town this and small town that. There's many reasons why people move to a small town, and it's not just because they can't handle the debauchery of the big city. So, like you say, these pedophiles are sometimes driven out of city neighborhoods because people are a little more savvy, and sometimes they reside in small places because they can hide there. And and who knows? They could be on the run for all anyone knows. So,
exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, this was a interesting interview, and again, a fantastic book, Searching for Sandra, the case of disappearance of Sandra Cantu. You also have a website that people can visit you, and I'm sure you're on Facebook as well. So maybe give us your website if people would like to check out other material that you do. You do fictional. You do write fiction, and also you have 2 other nonfiction books. If I'm not correct.
Right. I have a fiction series. It's obviously a female detective protagonist. And the books were actually, some of them were based on cases that I've worked. And one, The Devil's Closet, actually is a serial child killer. But if you go to Stacy Dittrich, and that's STACYDITTRICH.com, you can see my books there. I also have my memoir, Stumbling Along the Beat, which is my life as a female police officer. I grew up in a police family. My father and uncles each had anywhere from 43 to 46 years on the police department, and there were 4 of them. and I'm married to a police officer, so it's kind of a little bit in my blood. And I have the true crime book prior to this, which was Murder Behind the Badge, True Stories of Cops Who Kill. It's just essentially a compilation in history of police officers that went off the deep end, to say the least, and committed murder. And then, of course, they're searching for Sandra.
Yeah, very unique books too, and because offered from your unique perspective. So, but very, very interesting too. Cops who kill, very interesting stuff. And I want to thank you very much for this interview, Stacy. This has been great. People have been listening to Searching for Sandra, the story behind the disappearance of Sandra Cantu, with my special guest, Stacy Dittrich. I want to thank you very much, Stacy, for this interview, and hope to talk to you again soon about a new project.
Listen, Dan, thank you so much, and I love what you're doing. It's great.
Well, thank you very much, and you have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Good night.